Ramesh was a hard-working farmer who trusted his wife completely. Sita, his beautiful but restless wife, longed for a life filled with excitement. Vikram, a charming trader, became the spark that turned her secret desires into a deadly plan. Together, their lives collided in a shocking Valentine's Day tragedy that left one man dead, a family destroyed, and a village haunted by betrayal. In a quiet rural corner of northern India, life carried a rhythm that had hardly changed for generations. The rising of the sun was the alarm clock for the farmers, and the crowing of roosters echoed across the fields as men and women stepped into another day of labor. Cows were milked, seeds were sown, and plows scraped the soil until dusk painted the horizon in orange. Amid this landscape lived Ramesh, a hard-working farmer who was known in the village for his dedication to the land. His skin bore the marks of sun and toil, and his hands, though rough, worked tirelessly to provide for his family. To outsiders, his life might have seemed simple and repetitive, yet within the narrow boundaries of his farm, he carried dreams of growth, repairing his tractor, expanding his crops, and one day leaving more for his children than what had been left for him. Ramesh had married young, choosing Sita as his partner when both were in their early 20s. At the time, she had been admired for her beauty and grace. Villagers often recalled the day of their wedding, when the courtyard had been filled with music, laughter, and colorful garments. Over the years, however, the charm of marriage began to lose its sparkle. Their household was run smoothly but quietly. Sita took care of the chores and the children, while Ramesh spent his hours buried in the fields. There was food on the table, clothes on their backs, and a roof over their heads, yet something invisible was missing, a spark that no one dared to name. The neighbors, however, noticed changes in Sita. She was no longer the cheerful young bride they remembered. Her face often appeared distant, her steps slower, and her presence at community gatherings became rare. She found excuses to avoid festivals or women's circles where gossip about husbands and households flowed freely. Instead, she lingered near the marketplace more often than necessary. Sometimes she returned with small items that seemed unnecessary, other times with nothing at all. To those watching closely, it was as though she was searching for something she could not find at home. Ramesh himself never questioned her absences. His trust was unshaken, or perhaps his mind was too burdened with farming concerns to notice the shifts in his wife's behavior. When he looked at her, he saw the same woman he had married, the mother of his children, someone who managed the household while he managed the land. He did not sense the currents of dissatisfaction that ran beneath her silence, nor the quiet rebellion that was beginning to stir in her heart. Sita, meanwhile, felt trapped. Day after day, the same routines weighed heavily on her, the monotony pressing in from all sides. The mud walls of her home felt less like protection and more like confinement. She envied the women in stories who experienced excitement, romance, and freedom. What she longed for seemed far beyond her reach, yet her desire for change only grew stronger with time. Though the village carried on with its usual pace, an invisible storm was brewing inside her. A restless energy whispered that her life was meant for more than chores, more than meals prepared, and more than silent evenings with a husband whose eyes were always fixed on the soil. That storm would soon push her into decisions that could not be undone, and while the village remained unaware, the seeds of betrayal had already been planted in their midst. Sita's restlessness reached its breaking point when her path crossed with Vikram, a trader who moved between villages selling goods and collecting produce. Unlike the men she was accustomed to seeing every day, farmers bent under the weight of their tools, weary from harsh sun, Vikram carried himself with an air of confidence. His clothes were always cleaner, his shoes shinier, and his manner of speaking carried a charm that immediately set him apart. He was younger than Ramesh, his eyes sharper, and his smile lingered just long enough to make her feel noticed. For a woman who had long felt invisible in her own home, the smallest gestures from him seemed like sparks in the darkness. Their meetings began innocently. In the crowded lanes of the marketplace, their glances would meet briefly. He would greet her politely, and she would return the gesture without a word, but soon she began to anticipate those moments. Each trip to the market gave her a flutter of excitement, as though she were stepping into a secret world where her routine life no longer existed. The thought of returning home without seeing him left her restless, so she found reasons to extend her visits or create errands that gave her another excuse to linger. The secrecy added fuel to her desires. No one in the village could know, not her children, not her neighbors, not even the shopkeepers who watched everyone's comings and goings. Yet, the very act of keeping these meetings hidden made them feel more intoxicating. She felt young again, alive in a way she had not for years. Soon, what started as fleeting eye contact turned into longer conversations in hushed tones. Vikram was attentive in ways Ramesh never was. He complimented her appearance, asked about her feelings, and spoke of the world beyond the village boundaries. He fed the fire of her discontent, making her believe she deserved more than the life of a farmer's wife. As weeks turned into months, their bond grew stronger. The exchanges in the market shifted to secret rendezvous in the fields. Far from curious eyes, the risks were enormous, for the village thrived on gossip, and one careless step could ruin reputations forever. But each time she slipped away from home, her heartbeat quickened with anticipation rather than fear. She told herself that Vikram offered her something she had always craved: attention, passion, and the promise of freedom. Vikram, however, had his own motives. While he enjoyed the thrill of the affair, his thoughts stretched further. He saw Ramesh not only as an obstacle to his desires, but also as a man whose land and property could eventually be manipulated for gain. In whispered conversations, he began to plant ideas in Sita's mind. What if they could be together without hiding? What if she could live openly by his side? At first, she brushed these suggestions aside, horrified at the thought of betraying her husband so drastically. With each encounter, her resistance weakened. She convinced herself that she and Vikram were bound by something deeper than desire, that fate itself had brought them together. By the time the chill of winter began to fade and Valentine's Day crept closer, Sita no longer saw her life with Ramesh as bearable. She looked at her husband and felt the weight of suffocation. She looked at Vikram and saw escape. The idea of freedom became so powerful that the unthinkable started to seem possible. The plan was not yet spoken aloud, but in their stolen glances and coded words, its shadow already loomed. What began as an affair of stolen moments was slowly shaping into something far darker, something that would not only break her marriage but shatter the peace of the entire village. Valentine's Day came quietly, carrying with it an air of celebration unfamiliar to many in the village, slowly seeping into the younger generation through television, shops, and markets. For Sita, however, the day had been marked weeks in advance with a purpose no one else could imagine. What others saw as a harmless occasion of flowers and sweets, she saw as the perfect mask for a crime. The symbolism of love would provide her with the cover she needed, turning suspicion away from her when the moment arrived. Ramesh woke early that morning, as always, tending to the fields and returning by afternoon. To him, the day was no different than any other. He was focused on his crops, on broken part of his tractor he still needed to repair, and on preparing for the next season's sowing. He did not notice the strange restlessness in his wife's movements, the unusual way she avoided his gaze, or the way she lingered too long in the kitchen. To him, Sita's silence was just another part of her nature, nothing out of the ordinary. He had no reason to suspect that her hands were preparing more than just food. On the table that evening, Sita placed a box of sweets, lattice that Ramesh loved since childhood. She told herself that offering them as a Valentine's gesture would seem convincing. To anyone watching, it would look like a rare moment of affection between husband and wife, a surprise in a marriage long marked by routine. Yet, hidden inside those innocent-looking sweets was the powder Vikram had given her, carefully mixed so it could not be detected. The substance was potent, colorless, and tasteless, chosen specifically because it would leave little immediate trace. Ramesh accepted the gift without hesitation. For him, sweets from his wife on such a day felt unusual but pleasant, a small joy in an otherwise ordinary evening. He ate them slowly, savoring the taste, never once realizing that each bite was carrying poison through his veins. Sita watched him, her face carefully controlled, forcing her lips into an expression of calm while her heart pounded violently in her chest. The children were kept away from the sweets under the excuse that they were for their father alone. They did not question it, though their young eyes noticed their mother's stiffness. Hours passed, and the effects began to show. Ramesh felt sudden cramps, his stomach twisting as if gripped by unseen hands. His breathing grew shallow, his face pale, his body weakened until he could barely stand. Sita acted her role with precision, raising cries for help, calling neighbors and pretending to panic. Villagers rushed in, shocked by the farmer's sudden illness. He was carried to the nearest clinic in a desperate attempt to save him, but by the time they arrived, poison had already done its work. His heart gave out, leaving him lifeless on the hospital bed. The doctor, unfamiliar with the deeper truth, declared it a case of food poisoning, common in rural areas where contamination was frequent. A death certificate was issued, mentioning natural causes. Villagers mourned his passing, believing it to be fate. They surrounded Sita with sympathy, consoling her, praising her strength, and offering prayers. She wore the mask of a grieving widow so well that none could see through it. Yet beneath her veil of tears, she felt a dark satisfaction. Convinced that she had finally broken free from the chains of her marriage, she believed her future with Vikram was now closer than ever, unaware that the poison she thought had erased her problems had instead left behind invisible traces that would eventually expose her deception. In the day following Ramesh's death, the village returned to its usual rhythm, though a shadow lingered over it. The farmer's passing was spoken of in hushed voices near the well and in the market lanes. Some shook their heads, saying life was cruel to take a hardworking man so suddenly, while others whispered theories about bad food or an unseen illness. Sita moved through these days wearing the mask of grief, her eyes lowered, her steps slow, her words few. She accepted condolences with folded hands, sometimes even letting tears fall in public, though her heart carried a secret sense of relief. To most, she was simply a widow struck by tragedy, but a few neighbors began to watch her more closely, sensing something unusual beneath her calm exterior. The first stirrings of doubt did not come from the villagers, but from Ramesh's elder brother, Mohan, who lived in a nearby town. When news of the sudden death reached him, he was unsettled. He knew his brother to be strong and rarely ill, and the explanation of food poisoning felt thin. On visiting the village, he studied Sita's behavior with quiet suspicion. Her mourning seemed rehearsed, and the timing of the illness gnawed at his mind. Unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, Mohan insisted on speaking with local authorities, urging them to look deeper. At first, the police hesitated. Cases of food contamination were common, and the doctor's certificate mentioned no foul play. But Mohan was persistent. He demanded that Ramesh's stomach contents, which had been preserved during the medical examination, be sent for testing in the city laboratory. Reluctantly, the request was approved, and within weeks the results arrived. The report revealed traces of a strong pesticide, one not found naturally in food. It was a chemical often used in farming, but deadly when ingested, pointing unmistakably toward deliberate poisoning. The discovery shattered the illusion of natural death. The authorities reopened the case, and suspicion immediately turned to those closest to the victim. Questions fell heavily on Sita, who had prepared the sweets on the day her husband died. Investigators began tracing her movements, interviewing neighbors, and piecing together her recent habits. Stories surfaced of her frequent visits to the marketplace, of her unusual interest in dressing neatly before stepping out, and of her time spent in the company of Vikram, the trader. Witnesses admitted they had seen them together in secluded corners, their conversations too frequent and their body language too familiar. Vikram, sensing danger, attempted to distance himself from Sita. He avoided her, ceased his visits to the village, and denied any close connection when questioned. But small details betrayed him. Trinkets and small luxuries had appeared in Sita's possession, items she could not have afforded alone. Neighbors recalled seeing her return from the market with expressions of unusual excitement, and a few remembered her slipping away at odd hours when Ramesh was working in the fields. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to take shape. As the noose tightened, Sita was arrested, her cries of innocence unable to mask the mounting evidence. Vikram too was taken into custody, though he tried desperately to shift the blame onto her, claiming he knew nothing of the poison and had been unfairly linked to her crime. The villagers, who had once surrounded her with sympathy, now turned their faces away in anger and disgust. Newspapers picked up the story, labeling it the Valentine's Day murder, describing a woman who had chosen betrayal over loyalty and conspired with her lover to end her husband's life. The peaceful village that had once seemed untouched by scandal now found itself at the center of a tale that carried shame, anger, and shock. What had appeared to be an act of Fate was revealed to be a calculated crime, and the unraveling of lies had only just begun. The trial became the talk of the region, drawing not only villagers but also journalists and curious onlookers from nearby towns. The courtroom filled each day with a restless crowd eager to hear the details of how an ordinary farmer's life had been cut short on a day associated with love. Prosecutors worked carefully, laying out a narrative that left little room for doubt. They explained how Sita and Vikram had grown close, how their affair had taken root in secrecy, and how together they devised a plan to rid themselves of Ramesh. They described the poison found in his body, the sweets that served as the weapon, and the way Valentine's Day had been used to disguise the act as a gesture of affection. Forensic reports, witness accounts, and evidence of Sita's unexplained possessions all combined to paint a clear picture of conspiracy. The defense attempted to weaken this case, portraying Sita as a woman who had been manipulated by Vikram. They argued that she was a lonely wife, trapped in a marriage devoid of love, and that Vikram had taken advantage of her vulnerability, pushing her toward a crime she would never have committed alone. They painted her as more of a victim than a criminal, insisting her actions were driven by desperation and coercion. On the other hand, Vikram's lawyers placed the blame squarely on her, describing her as the mastermind who lured him into the situation, claiming he had never provided poison or encouraged her to kill. Each side fought to distance their client from the weight of guilt, but the evidence refused to bend under these arguments. The judge listened carefully as the case stretched over weeks, the gallery packed each day with those hungry for every new revelation. The villagers who once spoke of Ramesh's sudden death as an accident now sat silently as the sordid truth unfolded. They heard about Sita's secret meetings, her sudden change in behavior, and the undeniable traces of pesticide found in her husband's body. They listened to testimonies from neighbors who had seen her with Vikram, and to experts who confirmed that the poison could not have been consumed by mistake. Piece by piece, the story came together like a dark puzzle, leaving little doubt about the roles each had played. When the final judgment was announced, the courtroom fell silent. Both Sita and Vikram were found guilty of murder and conspiracy, each sentenced to life imprisonment. For the villagers, the verdict carried a heavy mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, yet the cost of that justice was painful. 2 children were left behind, stripped of their parents not by death alone but by betrayal and imprisonment. Families who once shared bonds of trust now looked at each other with suspicion, fearful of the hidden desires that could lead to such destruction. In the months that followed, rumors continued to circulate. Some claimed that Vikram had never truly loved Sita, that he had planned to abandon her once Ramesh was gone. Others whispered that she had wavered on the day of the poisoning, but pressed forward out of fear of losing him. These stories, whether true or not, deepened the tragedy, showing how greed, passion, and desperation had consumed lives beyond repair. The children were taken in by relatives, their futures marked by a stain they had no hand in creating. The tale of the Valentine's Day poisoning lingered long after the case closed, retold as both a crime story and a cautionary warning. In the quiet fields where Ramesh once worked, the villagers no longer saw only the image of a farmer tending his land. They also remembered the betrayal that unfolded behind closed doors, the hidden affair that led to his death, and the deception carried out under the guise of love. What began as secret glances between 2 restless hearts had ended in prison walls, broken families, and a legacy of sorrow that the community would never forget.